Leviticus 18:18. And you shall not take a woman as a rival wife to her sister, uncovering her nakedness while her sister is still alive. There's a pretty eye-opening debate about what the meaning of Leviticus 18:18 is. And on the surface, it appears to be a law prohibiting a man from marrying a woman and her sister. There's a very, very popular argument that has surfaced that this is not against marrying biological sisters, but rather a law against marrying two women at the same time in general. Now, this debate centers its efforts on how to define the phrase, quote, a woman and her sister. One polygamy expositor position may say that this law would never have been necessary if polygamy was just outlawed from the get-go. So to specify a type of polygamy that is prohibited is actually proof that polygamy is allowed in general. Only that sororal polygamy is outlawed specifically. Now, the critic's point of view in response to this is that this law is not speaking against marrying sisters specifically, but against marrying any two women at the same time, since sisters is to be understood as sisters in Israel, or, quote, sisters nationally speaking, not literally or biologically speaking. Now, either interpretation of what this phrase in this law means, on if its sisters here are biological or if they are simply national, both interpretations could be right. Not at the same time. I'm saying either one could be right. I've looked at the arguments, and they both are pretty well argued that sisters may well just be a reference to any two unrelated women in Israel. But both sides on this issue have wrongly concluded that the answer to this debate decides the legal and moral fate of polygamy, when in fact they've ignored the entire rest of the verse, which does have much more to say about the issue. It's a command that has 4 qualifiers in what it communicates, and yet everyone only talks about the first qualifier, while outright ignoring or just brushing past the other 3. Let's look at a transliterated version of this text, straight from the Hebrew. I'll use a favorite of mine, Young's literal translation. Leviticus 18:18. And a woman unto another thou dost not take to be an adversary, to uncover her nakedness beside her in her life. The portion that receives almost exclusive attention is, quote, a woman unto another thou dost not take. And the qualifiers that follow are almost entirely ignored. Let's go through each qualifier, starting with the first. To be an adversary. So the pro-polygamy expositor would say here, so you see, you can take another wife, but just not as a rival. You can take a second wife, but you can't use her to vex the first wife. Easy enough. The anti-polygamy expositor would say, no, it's impossible to take a second wife without the first wife being jealous or vexed, and thereby taking a second wife violates this law automatically. Just in response to that, one would wonder why he doesn't reach the same conclusion when it comes to having more than one child. Does he think that having 2 children will always lead to rivalry and jealousy? If so, then why would he not conclude that having more than one child is also wrong? If he thinks not, then he has to leave room for the same possibility in marriage as well. Now let's go to the second qualifier. It goes like this: to uncover her nakedness. Both sides agree on what this qualifier means. It's to have sex with her. The prohibition is against taking a second woman as a rival for the purpose of having sex with her. But the qualifiers continue. So to answer the question of in what way is it wrong to take a second woman as a rival for the purpose of having sex with her, the third qualifier adds beside her. Quote, her being the first woman or the first sister. The prohibition is against having sex with the second woman beside the first woman. Now, I think that this here, the word beside, this is where the crux of the matter lies on this law. But before diving into that, let's look first at the last qualifier. In her life. That is, while the first woman is still alive, both sides can agree that it is not wrong for a man whose wife has died to take the dead woman's sister as his bride, because doing so is not in the first's lifetime. There is another possible nuanced understanding of this qualifier, but it doesn't change the substance of the content being communicated. So, Now going back to the beside her line. The word beside is in Hebrew al. It's Strong's Concordance 5921. And the book definition of this word, given by Strong's itself, is, quote, upon, above, over. Now, when you look at all the examples of how this word is used, the overwhelmingly most common way it's utilized is to communicate the concept of being above or over something else. The Bible does use this word when describing polygamous marriages. So to better understand this law in Leviticus and how this word al is used in that law, let's look at that example. In Genesis 28, starting at verse 6 through verse 9, it says, "Now Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan Aram to take a wife from there, and that as he blessed him, he directed him, 'You must not take a wife from the Canaanite women.' And that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and gone to Padan Aram. So when Esau saw that the Canaanite women did not please Isaac his father, Esau went to Ishmael and took as his wife, besides the wives he had, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth." That word, quote, besides the wives he had. This story is communicating the concept that Esau took this woman to find favor with his parents. In a manner of speaking, he married her over the other wives he already had. It's the same word used there in Leviticus 18:18 as it is in Genesis 28, besides the wife. He didn't find his parents' favor with his other wives, so Esau sought favor by marrying her over the others. If you look at the Greek Septuagint of Leviticus 18:18, it communicates the same. It says from the Greek, "A wife in addition to her sister, you shall not take as a rival to uncover her indecency instead of her while she is alive." So it isn't beside her, it's instead of her. That is, you are not to take a second wife and have sex with her, effectively replacing the first wife, even though you still be legally married. Now that would create rivalry, but it also would be violating the spirit of the law, which prohibits a man from divorcing his wife so as to marry another. Now, so far, I've looked at different sources to understand the meaning of the word all, to argue that it is better translated as over, or better yet, instead, in Leviticus 18:18. But in order to get a better understanding of what the entirety of Leviticus 18:18 means and what it is concerned with, we can look at another verse that uses almost the exact same verbiage and wording as Leviticus 18:18. And understanding what that verse is communicating. In Genesis 31, Jacob is fleeing from Laban, the father of Jacob's two wives. And when Laban is chasing Jacob, he has an encounter with God in a dream, where God warns Laban not to say anything good or bad to Jacob. That is, don't bestow any blessings or curses onto Jacob. So Laban, instead, decides to make a covenant with Jacob. And one of the lines in that covenant that Jacob agrees to, with God as the witness, is this verse in verse 50. "If you oppress my daughters, or if you take wives besides my daughters, although no one is with us to see, God is witness between you and me." Now compare that line to the King James Version of Leviticus 18:18, which says, "Neither shalt thou take a wife to her sister to vex her, to uncover her nakedness beside the other in her lifetime." Those two phrases, quote, "if you oppress my daughters," end quote, of Genesis, and, quote, "to vex her," end quote, in Leviticus, are different Hebrew words, but they communicate the exact same concept. Both words communicate the idea of abuse, harassment, vexation, or the like. Now, not only that, but the phrase, quote, "to take wives besides my daughters," in Genesis, and the phrase, quote, "beside the other," in Leviticus, both use the same Hebrew word for beside, which is al, to communicate the same concept. So if we understand Laban's concern here in Genesis, it stands to reason that we'd get a better understanding of what the concern in Leviticus 18:18 is. So what is Laban's concern? If you oppress my daughters, or if you take wives besides my daughters. Is Laban concerned here with Jacob practicing polygamy? Well, no, because Laban was the one who gave both his daughters as wives to Jacob. That seems obvious enough. And keep in mind, the Hebrew word for wives in this verse can also be translated as women, as we've already gone over in previous videos. But okay, maybe Laban is not concerned with polygamy per se. But is Laban concerned with Jacob taking on any more women at all? Is Laban concerned that Jacob is going to have other sexual relationships beyond the ones he has with his two wives? Again, the answer is no. Because at the same time of this covenant being made, Jacob has two other women besides his wives. He has his two concubines, Zilpah and Bilhah, both of which are present at the sealing of this covenant. But Laban knows they are his concubines and are not a threat at all to the descendants of his daughters, because concubines did not have the inheritance rights over the inheritance rights of wives. So Laban's concern is best understood as no other woman getting better treatment, be it inheritance rights or otherwise, than Rachel and Leah in Jacob's harem. This is consistent with Laban's opening statement to the covenant when he says in verse 43, "The daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. But what can I do this day for these my daughters, or for their children whom they have borne?" And then Laban, after making that preface, makes the covenant with Jacob. And Jacob was not in violation of this covenant when he gave gifts to his concubines or the children they bore him. So Laban was really only concerned here with Jacob showing more favor to other women over his two daughters as Jacob's wives. And we can easily see that that is also the concern in Leviticus 18:18. That a man is not to show favoritism to one wife over another wife by having sex with her over the other's life. But Paul teaches the same thing in 1 Corinthians 7, when he says that a wife has an entitlement to sex in the marriage covenant. An entitlement that is not granted to a concubine, as we see in the case of David not sleeping with his concubines after they betrayed him by sleeping with Absalom. And we also see it in Exodus 21 when we went over the list of entitlements a concubine is to have. And sex is not one of them. So Leviticus 18:18, whether it's referring to biological sisters or national sisters, if we are to understand it in light of the understanding of Laban's concern for his daughters, we are to understand Leviticus 18:18 as also being concerned about a man creating rivalry between his wives by having sex with one instead of the other, so as to vex one over the other. And in the same way in Genesis, Laban is not concerned about Jacob exercising polygamy when he uses this phrasing to make a covenant with him. So too is the Leviticus 18:18 law not concerned with banning polygamy when it's prohibiting a man from having relations with one wife instead of the other.